Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Over the next few episodes, we're going to undertake a few unique projects to fill in this western side of downtown, starting today with the city's government complex. Before we get to that, though, we have to work on the road network a little bit and deal with this thing, which is the result of an aborted episode that I attempted to make last year and did not work out whatsoever. Don't worry though, we'll come back in the future to add some spaghetti back in, but for now I'm just going to get rid of it so that we can expand the avenue we built last episode out into this space, followed by the downtown grid. So the plan for today is to focus on this area, building City Hall and Central Park at the intersection of Main Street and this major avenue, which doesn't have a name yet, followed by a collection of more modern government offices and city services up here, and finally a small extension of downtown to give the build some context. We're going to get right into it with City Hall. I had initially tried more or less to recreate Duluth's aesthetically pleasing government complex, but it just came out horribly. So I decided to come up with my own, much simpler design that hopefully is going to evoke a similar sort of place. An exhaustive workshop search led me to this asset, Le Meridian Courthouse by McWelshman. I'm going to center it in the middle of this double block and build a sort of frame around it with terraforming roads. And that way I can control exactly how the terrain interacts with the building, which is going to come in handy because I want to have the front of the building be one story lower than the back, if that makes sense. With that all set up, it's time to work on the landscaping. I'm taking inspiration here from the Michigan State Capitol in Lansing, basically taking this bowed X shape of the pathways and trying to simplify it into a nice symmetrical pattern. Hopefully that's going to result in some green space that looks nice from above, but is also walkable and pleasant from a Sim's point of view. If a Sim even has a point of view, I don't know. I initially was going to have a small pull-through and parking lot out front, but I decided to scrap that and replace it with more pedestrian paths. I figured that even if you did need to drive a vehicle right up to the building for whatever reason, you could just drive along the paths if you have authorization. I mean, you could probably do it if you didn't. Anyway, that's something I've seen at places like universities, where you'll have retractable bollards to allow access for service vehicles. Because of the terraforming roads that I set up before, the only place we have to worry about the steep terrain, at least where it interacts directly with the building itself, is right here at the transition point between the two elevations. To cover it up, I'm just going to build some little terraces, which are also going to double as additional side entrances to the building. I'm going to add a door prop there in a minute. To do this, I'm just using some retaining walls topped by a nice balustrade, and then I'm going to add another small set of stairs over here to go up to the level of the path, which is already starting to slope up to get up to the next level of road. It's all pretty tedious to line this kind of thing up properly, but I think it's worth it, both to cover up the terrain and to add a little character to the building. Then after a few more decorations to make it look a little bit more inviting for all the totally on the up and up meetings that go on in City Hall, I'm going to add another one on the other side of the building. Because the building is a little bit asymmetrical, the one on this side ends up being a little bit bigger, a little bit different, but we're going to go ahead and balance that out later on with some detailing back on the other side. The next layer of details is going to be a set of planters around the base of the building. IMT makes it pretty easy here, especially now that we're working with some curved networks, so I'm just using the same retaining wall networks as before and lowering them quite a ways down to make it look like a short garden wall. This rectangular planter over here is meant to balance out the larger terrace on the other side like I was talking about. So I'm going to place down the same kinds of trees from the terrace and hope that these things sort of balance out even though it's not symmetrical. Of course, we also need some actual plants in these planters. I'm coming up with a basic pattern with these small trees in their own planters, separated by some shrubs, and then each kind of section has some flowers in front of it. These pinkish red ones that stick up look vaguely like amaranth to me, so I'm thinking that they would have some of the city's namesake out front in their gardens, which I think is kind of nice, plus they just look pretty good. Then I'm going to alternate those with these lighter purple flowers. For the remainder of the grounds, I wanted to go for something slightly less manicured, but still with enough foliage to try to persuade people to stick to the paths. So I'm going to create kind of a natural wall with these hedges, where they've just let the grass and some flowers grow up around it instead of keeping it perfectly manicured. And even more importantly than keeping people from straying off the path, I think it's just a lot nicer to be around this kind of growth than a perfectly trimmed lawn. So this row of hedges leads up to a small fountain across from the steps of City Hall, which I'm making with this water texture prop, and then I'm putting some ploppable pavement underneath just because it's easy to form into the right shape with PO, and changing it into a brighter blue to emphasize the color of this shallow water. I didn't want this fountain to be too fancy and take attention away from the facade of the building, which is kind of the main attraction here. So I'm just going to add a simple pattern with these animated fountain props, clipping them into some bollards that represent the spouts. And of course, it also needs some cool lighting for nighttime as well. I imagine this would only be in operation in the summer since they'd have to drain it for the winter. So maybe it doesn't even make sense to have this here in the first place, but I kind of like it, so I'm going to go ahead and keep it there. The reason I chose this location in the city in particular for this build was because it's at the intersection of two roads with streetcar service. So of course the streetcars are going to stop nearby. The stops themselves are pretty simple. I'm just using the shelters that I cobbled together back in, I think it was episode 2, but I wanted to make sure that the context of them makes sense. So in this case, I wanted to make sure that the crosswalks are going to line up with the pathways. You can see that most clearly over on this wider avenue, where I'm going to use Node Controller to make sure the crosswalks line up perfectly. And I think that's just kind of satisfying that the pedestrian infrastructure is exactly in line where the former cross street would have been that has since been demolished to make room for these double block developments. Because this road asset has space for perpendicular parking spots built in, I just need to cover up this little bit of pavement where the streetcar stops. The platform is technically on the median, but since this is a low speed and relatively low traffic road, I think it's fine for people to wait on the side of the road and then cross when the streetcar pulls up, presumably just like it would have been back in the pre-car days. It would probably be more realistic to do angled parking here, but I didn't have an angled parking asset that works well on a slope, so I just decided to go for these perpendicular spots, which fit very nicely and function nicely on a slope. Oh, and I wanted to add a bit of functionality as well, so I clipped in a few office blocks and an entertainment block as well. It looks kind of weird to have them lowered down into the terrace there, but it's the only spot I could get them to have road access and actually be clipped into the structure. Next up, we have Central Park. I wanted to keep it relatively simple, so I'm just going to connect each corner to its opposite corner and each side to its opposite side. And then instead of having just this single point where they all converge, I'm going to add a set of circular paths at the center. So with this design, you can enter the park from any direction, follow the outer circle as kind of a circulator, and then exit from any direction you want. Might get a bit confusing if you're not exactly sure which direction is which, but oh well. Then the central circle in the middle here is going to be an attraction in itself, which we'll get to in just a second. Before that, I wanted to spruce up these paths and make them a bit more attractive. I'm going to cover up the ruining texture the same way I did last episode using these grass networks. Then I'm going to create a filler and add this custom brick texture. I do have to change the offsets a little to make the filler fit properly, but luckily IMT has this feature where you can save the offsets and it applies them to all networks of this type, which is really convenient. Another convenient feature is that the angle of each filler texture seems to be universal, so it's not dependent on the orientation of the network that you're using. So as long as you keep the angle consistent within the IMT settings, it's going to match up the texture perfectly across all the segments and nodes of the same kind of asset at least. So all those features make it really quick to completely convert an asset like that into something that looks totally different, which is super nice. Then the only real adjustments that I have to make are for the intersections, just adding some grass networks along the corners and making a new filler that covers the whole thing. You can kind of see here how the angle of the texture lines up across the different nodes and segments. But I only have to do that once for the 4-way intersections and once for the 3-way intersections, and then I can just copy and paste the version with the adjustments, and every setting carries over perfectly. At the center, I wanted some kind of monument, something secular and ideologically uncontroversial, if not neutral, and I figured basically everyone loves a good obelisk, so I'm going to go with that. Plus it gives you one culture and one loyalty per turn, which is really nice to have in the early game. The rest of the park is going to be a lot more casual than this, with some picnic tables around the center, and we're also going to add some along other parts of the park as well in a minute, and an arrangement of some of my favorite tree assets around the center. I wanted to tack on a couple more features so as to draw in all the people who aren't particularly interested in obelisks or trees. So there are some basketball courts over here with just a little bit of detailing, and a tennis court across the pathway as well. I think they feel a little cramped over here, but I don't think that's necessarily unrealistic. And there are a lot of trees over here as well, since I'm thinking you'd probably want a lot of shade around here, at least during the summertime. And over on the opposite side, just to work as kind of a mirror of the sports area, there's a small playground. Then I'm just going to go ahead and add a smattering of additional trees with these smaller ones along the road, kind of doubling up as street trees. And I'm going to leave most of this empty space empty for people who want to touch grass. And with that, Central Park is done. Over the decades, the scope of local administration has grown in Amaranth, so they've needed to add some more buildings and services to this district. We're going to start with the main government office building after City Hall, of course. I'm thinking that a lot of the city's more recent expansion would have occurred in the wake of increased iron mining during the Second World War. So to represent that period and that new influx of population and ideas, we have these international-style office towers by Dudemeister, which I'm clipping together to create a U shape with a small courtyard in the center, just to keep things interesting. Or I guess it would be a donut shape if you include the parking garage, which is also meant to evoke these post-war changes. I did think it was a little too tall, so I'm going to just cut out a few floors using PO, which definitely does not result in a hideous seam that you should ignore. And just for good measure, I'm also going to add a surface parking lot over to the side. The terrain on this side of downtown is quite steep, so I'm going to have to make a lot of retaining walls to cover at least the most egregious cliffs. I'm just using these retaining wall networks and some ploppable grass and hiding any of the ugly seams that are left with some foliage, of course. I'll try not to bore you too much with these because when I say we're going to have to build a lot of them, I mean we're going to have to build a lot of them. So I'm going to cut some of that out or just cut it way down. Same thing with all these surface parking lots. We're going to have to build a lot of those as well. These office building assets already look great on their own, but they do need a few more details just to make them feel purpose-made for our environment. So I have to go in and add some entrances and all the props that you would expect to go alongside with those. And I'm also going to clip in some office blocks as I work on that just to make this building functional since I had to turn it into a PO. So we have a side entrance over here by the parking lot and a street-facing main entrance over here, which I have to do a little bit of terraforming with because there is this slight slope in both directions. For the most part, I wanted the donut hole to speak for itself, so we're not going to overload it with details. Just a small path to connect the garage to the office and a couple of nice trees. Then to bring a little bit more life to the place, I'm going to do the now classic invisible path trick, lining up the vanilla path from entrance to entrance, making sure that everything is matching the right elevation of the visual component of the path that we've already detailed, and then upgrading it to the invisible version so we can now actually get some people moving through these areas. If you'll remember back to last episode where I talked about this avenue that runs at an angle to the grid and how its expansion caused a lot of disruption to the development around it, I want to continue that motif here in these angled blocks that it creates, which are going to become the homes for some new city services. First, over here, we have the city's main vehicle maintenance hub. So it's basically a glorified auto shop, although there is some administration housed here. So I'm going to go ahead and clip in this little office facade using this ever-handy generic office pack. And then I'm going to clip some road maintenance vehicle blocks into these garage doors so that we can have a sensible place for all of our maintenance vehicles to emerge from. And it also gets an adorable parking lot. Before moving on to the next city service, I wanted to quickly add in another expansion to the administrative part of the complex with what might be the most generic office building ever created. And really the only reason I added this was so that I could add as many sky bridges as possible to the complex. So we have this one connecting the two more modern offices, and then one connecting both of those up to City Hall. Unfortunately, all the older looking ones in my collection wouldn't really look good for this long of a span, so I had to use a more modern one, but I think it ends up looking okay. And of course I did the same pedestrian path trick so that we can watch our Sims wandering around trying to find out where to report for jury duty. The next service is going to be the city's main fire station. I'd like to have a historic fire station somewhere else around the downtown that's maybe been converted for use as something else, but this one is going to be the main functional one, which is more modern and higher capacity. I didn't think this block really needed too much detailing because the asset just looks really nice on its own. So I'm just going to do the same style of lot as we did for the maintenance vehicle building, using the big parking lot roads, sharpening the corners with node controller, and adding a pavement base around the building along with some parking spots for the firefighters, presumably. So with the government-focused part of the build done, I wanted to give all of this just a little bit of context before we finish up so that it feels more integrated into the downtown, because right now it looks kind of detached and isolated, which makes me sad. So we're going to start by taking inspiration from this fat office building in Duluth, which takes up a whole half a block and also has this interesting feature around front where there's an entrance to the built-in parking garage from the other side of the block, and it's fit into these wall-to-wall shops. So I'm going to go ahead and do something similar, but instead of having it be a garage entrance, it's going to be a pedestrian entrance, both to the office building, but also providing access to the downtown Skybridge network, which totally exists at this point in time. Then, of course, we have to line the streets with buildings, trying to stick to 1 to 2 story pre-war buildings, but there are some taller or more modern ones in there as well. My plan is to carry this style of brick low-rise development all the way along the main street up until the angled avenue, which is kind of the natural endpoint of downtown, thinking that most of it is either the kind of historic pre-war building that I was talking about, or more modern construction meant to check all the same stylistic boxes as those older buildings. Now I'm going to connect up the office with the block across the street, at first using this old looking bridge, but realizing pretty quickly that you'd have something more modern attached to this modern office. So I'm going to go ahead and set that aside for when we connect up the train station and use this one instead. For some additional modern contrast, I'm going to take inspiration from this thing in Duluth, and to do that I'm going to use this asset, which is Belfer Hall by Kreidershot. I know brutalism gets a bad rap and it's probably deserved, but I really like this particular kind of building with all the vertical lines, and I also like that it's brick, so you could almost mistake it for one of our turn-of-the-century brick towers if you don't look closely enough. In Duluth, there's this funny little parking lot across the alley with a skinny row of buildings on the other side, and I thought that was just too weird to not take inspiration from. So I'm going to do that by squeezing down some buildings to a 1-unit depth, thinking that maybe they used to be normal 4-unit deep buildings, and they've just kept the facades for show, or just downsized the shops that were inside them. And then there's a final length of Skybridge going from this taller one over to the new tower. So people could go all the way from the train station up to the street in front of City Hall without having to go outside. Finally, after some quick details around the base of the tower, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly fill up the remaining portion of the block, and we're done for the day. Although, if you are interested, I made some changes to the skyline, adding in some more modern towers to parallel the post-war growth of the city that I've been talking about, and also rearranging some of the bulkier, iconic mid-rise buildings to be clustered in a more realistic way. At least I think so. I actually wasn't originally going to record and upload this, but I accidentally left OBS running while I was working on it, so there is some footage of it, which I'll upload in a separate video if you're interested in that. You can find it linked down in the description. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.
But we're going and make a scene, doing all we can, 'cause we're stuck